Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Pan's Labyrinth. So, I had finally gone onto Netflix, sat down, and watched this film because reasonably, the entire movie is done in European Spanish. Because I checked because I was like, well, hey, like, are they ever going to dub this? And I had researched this a little bit of this movie, and I had heard that the director who had done this film had immediately said that there will never be a dubbed version of this movie because uh, it should be done the way it's done. It's not going to be dubbed over in English ever. So a lot of people were desperately looking and seeing, like, well, am I ever going to find a dubbed version of this movie? And the answer will always emphatically be no. So I went and I watched this movie regardless of me having to read subtitles throughout this entire movie because I wanted to understand or get why a lot of people were buzzing about this movie. I have consistently heard from people here and there reminding me about this film, about Pan's Labyrinth. And so, when going into this movie, finally, I'm going to have to talk about this film at first in a very cryptic like sense, and then I will get into spoilers about this movie. So, how did I feel about this movie in a very cryptic like sense? Well, in all actuality, there is maybe a scene here or there that I probably did enjoy about this entire film, but everything else as a whole to me, while also having to read subtitles through this whole entire ordeal, did not really come out to me to be 100% worth it. Like, to me, I was watching this film and immediately I was like, yeah, there wasn't enough going on in this movie to garner me needing to go out of my way to see this film. There wasn't at any point where I was like, oh my god, this movie is groundbreaking. Oh my god, this is something I needed to go out of my way to see, find, whatever. This movie is kind of just kind of a like, I guess, for someone that just wanted to see something a little quite different, but this movie kind of reminds me of a plethora of numerous other movies. Like, if anything, this movie kind of popped in my head while watching this film. I'm like, this movie feels like the movie Nightbreed. Nightbreed kind of has it to where it's much more rated R. There's a lot more skin involved, let's just say, in that movie. And there's a lot more gross out moments going on with that film compared to this one. But then there's also one point in time within this movie that I was like, oh my god. Like, this part was gross, but yet awesome. But that was really about it for a bulk of this movie. Really, this kind of reminded me of a lot of old-fashioned films like a Schindler's List or a like, it just kind of reminded me of a bunch of like tyrant films and stuff along those lines. It kind of reminded me if like Sound of Music had done a sequel but had no music in the sequel movie. Like, it kind of reminded me of that, of what would to be of happened within a sequel Sound of the Music kind of thing. Uh, Plus, this also kind of reminded me of like a plethora of other films. It kind of reminded me of like Neverending Story, just because we have one girl who is really into like fairy tales and she gets sucked into this imaginary world that she gets to be where her home is right next to, bizarrely, because we have it to where uh, this girl had seen a labyrinth near her home, and she had gone into this, like, it kind of also reminded me a lot of Narnia. Like, we had it to where, hey, don't go into the closet kind of thing, and we have this girl who eventually tiptoes into the closet and eventually meets these bizarrish like characters for reasons that don't quite make sense to me. Really, that in a nutshell is what this movie really is. It's just a movie about uh, a quite possible war going on between a rebellion and the military, and then we have a girl who is going uh, into this labyrinth to see these bizarre creatures and get these keys for reasons that make no sense to me. That, in a nutshell, is basically hands down this movie, and I really didn't understand why I needed to go out of my way to see this film. There was no visual within this movie that I was saying, oh my god, I am impressed. I am impressed in any, like, if anything, probably when looking at this, uh, like, immediately a lot of people would just go, like, well, if you won't be impressed with this film, then you probably won't care about the movie Shape of Water, which is kind of the same director and kind of the same kind of quasi approach. I had repetitively started trying to watch The Shape of Water, but I've never continued the film. Like, I started it 2 to 3 times now, and I've never fully watched the entire thing. Eventually, I guess I will need to get there, but I just haven't yet. Every single time I go into that movie, I'm immediately like, I have something else to do. And so I stop watching the movie. So maybe sometime I will have to finally sit down and finally watch The Shape of Water and see why it was nominated for Oscars and whatever. So going into this film, I would say that for some people, I would say that this movie has a uh, like, it's kind of reminiscent to a certain kind of movie. Like I said, kind of like a Schindler's List, or kind of the kind of movies where you'd have uh, like maybe like a Les Miserables or something like that. Like, it kind of has a very old fashioned approach to it, kind of harping back on there being this like resistance against this military force, and uh, and there being a family involved in the middle of all this. Yeah, but in all actuality, there's a lot of fairy tale stuff going on in here, but nothing that I needed to, like, nothing that wowed me, nothing that uh, made me feel like this is something that just made me go wow at any point in this movie, because everything was at such a like, it really felt like this movie was like such a small little thing, uh, and I wasn't wowed by any of it, sadly enough. But because I like, because you have it to where this movie has put together such, like, everybody's talking about, like, Pan's Labyrinth. Oh my god, that movie! Wow. Or you have it to where people's like, yeah, I'm never going to see that because it's not going to be dubbed over, and so on and so forth. And so you have this kind of back and forth between people that are just kind of like, well, is it worth seeing? Or, like, because you have it to where you have this like Paul Bunyan Axe story about this movie that people have said, oh man, this movie, oh, like, to where whenever you talk about a Del Toro movie or whatever, like, yeah, but have you seen Pan's Labyrinth? And now I have, and I'm like, yeah, not quite wowing to me. When looking at movies like Hellboy or something along those lines, like, I was like, man, those are like huge, big scale things. To where this one, I was just kind of like, okay, like, it has a very wild like story, but overall, it's not something that felt that I like needed to go out of my way to see this film. It's not that. It's not that at all. So going into here, let's go into spoilers. Sadly enough, there might be some people that are like, "Well, you just don't know films. You don't know a good film when it hits you in the face and something like that." I know some people might have that reaction to this kind of film because they love it. Maybe there's some kind of visual or some kind of something in here, like a childlike story that people could really hold on to and or appreciate, which I can understand that. I just, for me, to have invested in a subtitle movie on top of the fact that, like, there was never, like, a huge, big moment in this movie to where I was like, yeah, this is the reason why I saw this film. There was never that in this movie, to be brutally honest. So, let's go out of our way to go on and go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, we have it at the very beginning of this movie that we have Olivia and we have her mother, which I believe her name is Carmen. And we have it to where Olivia's mother is pregnant and she is also sick, we are to believe. So, because we have it to where Olivia's mother is traveling while she is pregnant, because we have it to where this guy, I'm just going to call him the captain because that's what they call him throughout the entire movie. We end up having him wanting to have his son on where he is at, where he lives on a certain side of Spain, before his son is to be delivered into this world. And so we end up having it to where Olivia is kind of a fairy tale-ish like girl. She loves to read stories. She has a bunch of books with her, and she loves to tell stories. Every single night we have Olivia who is telling a story to her brother that, of course, is inside her mother's womb and stuff along those lines. So we have it to where Olivia and her mother make their way out to see the captain, and we end up having Olivia's mother telling her, it's like, well, hey, you got to make a really good impression, call him dad, all kinds of things. Like, he really wants, like, you should really try and win him over, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where Olivia's mother is to get out of the car and to immediately see a wheelchair, and the captain is to tell her, hey, well, like, don't overexert yourself, put yourself in a wheelchair, so that way we can just kind of like haul you around, basically. And so we have it to where Olivia's mother, like, dude, I can walk, and he's like, no, like, come on, like, let's put you in a wheelchair and just kind of let you just like. So we end up having the doctor checking over the pregnant woman, and he is saying, like, well, in all to be considered, like, she is sick, but like, she is like perfectly fine. She's not really running a fever, and like the baby should be fine and everything like that. And so we end up having the doctor telling the captain, it's like, well, she really shouldn't have like been traveling while she's been pregnant. And we end up having, of course, the captain saying, well, I needed my baby on the right side of Spain, and so on and so forth, and blah blah blah, because this captain is some kind of like, he wants his baby, I guess, to be pure, I guess, is what he thinks, if he's on the right side of Spain, and whichever one, whatever, what have you. So we push on here to eventually have it to where the captain for a bulk of this movie is a person who is trying to find these uh, rebellion-ish like people. And so we end up in one portion of this movie, we end up having it to where the captain goes out to find two men who are supposedly hunting for rabbits. Because one of his military-ish like people told, hey, captain, like, come and meet these two guys. It seems that they are going and like they might be the rebellion. And so we have the captain going out of his way to meet these guys, and they are saying like, well, hey, like, we went out to go and hunt for rabbits. And so that's what the captain is to think is their story, but he is not buying it exactly. So we end up having the captain taking a bottle and ramming this bottle into this guy's face to where it completely caves in this guy's face. And I'm like, oh my god, this is the craziest moment in this entire movie, and it's also just super gross, but it was the craziest thing that I saw in this film. And so that was the most interesting thing about this entire movie, was just that cave in the face moment where I was like, good god, this is gross, but also awesome. So we end up having it to where the captain is to have killed the man, but then eventually they end up finding out, because the captain looks much more thoroughly, to realize that their story was actually legitimate, that it was actually true. And we end up having it to where the captain tells one of his guys in command, he's like, you should look way more thoroughly but before you actually go and make me have to go out here for this nonsense. Like, don't waste my time. And so we end up having it to where the captain ends up taking the rabbits and ends up giving it to the female cooks to go and cook for themselves, because it's like, no, like, I want to steal their stuff, and I'm because we're gonna, like, they were going to kill both of those people regardless. And so we end up having to where the captain ends up taking these bunnies and giving it to the cooks for them to make. So we end up having a girl named Mercedes that it seems that that the captain is like really like, I don't know if he's like really into her or what is that. I just don't know what that is. Or maybe the entire time he's thinking that there's something fishy about this girl, or there's something that sticks out about this girl. I don't quite have my finger on it exactly throughout a bulk of this movie, and it really just started to annoy me of, why didn't the captain say like how he felt about Mercedes or something like that, to where like, did he know the entire time that he was like, yeah, that Mercedes girl, there's something about her, and I think she's a spy or something, because Mercedes actually is a spy, and she's actually working for the resistance, and she eventually like walks off from time to time to eventually go and talk to the resistance. And we end up also finding out that the doctor is also working for the resistance as well. And I thought that was really fascinating. Like, even at one point we have it to where the doctor needs to chop off a guy's leg because it's useless. And so we have it to where like the one of the guys is like drinking this alcohol, and we end up having the doctor like going and taking the saw, and the guy is like, one momento, and then we end up having to where he's like, okay, go ahead. And so then he chops off the leg. Not a real true, like, he actually has to like saw the thing off, and I'm like, oh my god, this is awful. So while this is all going on, while this craziness is all going on, so we end up having it to where it seems that Olivia is a very fairy tale-ish like person, and so we end up having this bizarrish, buggish like thing. I don't know if it's like, I don't know what kind of bug it is, and I don't think it's an actual bug. It looks fairly weird. It looks like a praying mantis that has wings. That's what it kind of looks like to me. Or, like, I don't know. So, we end up having this bug eventually fly uh, into Olivia's room. And so instead of being scared by it or instead of trying to kill it, she ends up just letting it fly next to her while she's in her bed. And she ends up popping a book out to just say, like, well, hey, like, maybe this bug is actually a fairy. And so we end up having Olivia showing a picture of this to this bug of this fairy. And this bug ends up changing to look exactly like the picture and to showcase that this bug is actually legitimately a fairy. And so we end up having this fairy take Fiona out to the labyrinth because we end up having it to where Olivia had gone to this labyrinth before to have Mercedes say, like, oh, hey, yeah, this is a labyrinth, just so you know. And so we end up going along and having Olivia go into the labyrinth, and she ends up meeting a fern, some kind of goatish, headish man thing, goat, whatever. So I'm like, dude, this is like Narnia. Like, this is basically like Narnia. And so we end up having the fern telling Olivia that that supposedly Olivia isn't a normal human, that she had been born by the moon, and all kinds of bizarrish things. Basically saying that she was a princess of this labyrinth, and that her real father was some bizarrish like person, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having the fern telling Olivia, well, you need to do 3 tasks to me to earn your way into the labyrinth, to earn your stripes, so to speak. And so we end up having it to where the fern ends up giving Olivia this book that she cannot figure out how to read it because there is no writing on the pages. And we have it to where the fern is consistently telling her, it's like, well, hey, yeah, you have to get this job done before the next moon, the next moon or whatever. So we lead on to eventually have it to where it seems there is a number of keys that Olivia is consistently to get, to where these keys have something to do with some next objective. And a lot of this is just all weird and or bizarre, and it is what it is. So we have it to where the weirdest freaking bizarrish thing that goes on here. We end up having Olivia go out and the first task was that Olivia had to go and get a key from somewhere. And so we have it to where Olivia she was to take a bath and then to put on a nice dress to go to a dinner with the captain and be able to look nice. And she doesn't go to this dinner. Instead, she decides to go off to this place, and she ends up taking off her dress, but she still has like stuff, of course, underneath it. She ends up like squeezing into this one like little cave or cavern or something like that, to where she ends up greeting this gigantic looking frog thing, and this gigantic looking frog thing just roughs up this thing that has it to where Olivia ends up seeing that there's a key there, and she takes it, and then she walks out of this environment to realize that her dress had blown away and gotten all dirty, and she is all dirty, and now it's raining. So we end up having Olivia go back home to eventually just be put into yet another bath. To just be like, yeah, you're freaking dirty and whatever. So, moving on. So eventually we have it to where, within this movie, the captain is to try to find these resistant members, and he is trying to search of where they are. Eventually they get on horseback, and they're trying to search for these men, and eventually they end up finding like a little camp of sorts, and they end up noticing that there is a vial of antibiotics, and they also are to realize that like these people wherever they are aren't really all that far. So we have it to where the captain is yelling to the rebellion that, hey guys, like, why don't you come on back for your stuff? Like, hey, you dropped one of these antibiotics, so, like, hey, why don't you come on back? Like, come back to get your stuff. Like, I know you aren't very far from here, so come and get your stuff back, and so on and so forth. So, no one, of course, answers, and so reasonably they end up just leaving, trying to still try and find these resistant members somewhere in this forest. So, pushing on, we end up having Olivia coming back to the fern or the goat guy with her key, and so we end up having her with the task of, okay, well, you gotta go in through this room with this guy that is sitting on this table with all of this food, and this guy is bizarrely a guy that does not have an eye upon his face. It seems that he has eyes that he has on a plate that eventually he takes from this plate and puts these eyes on his hand, and then eventually he sees via doing this. And so, bizarrely enough, so we end up having Olivia, who is watching over this person, kind of like poking at the thing to just kind of see what it does. And so we end up having it to where Olivia ends up seeing these 3 different small doors. And so we have it to where Olivia opens one of the small doors and opens it up to see that there is a dagger that she has picked up. And so she was not supposed to eat any of the food that was on this guy's table, but we have it to where Olivia ends up grabbing 2 grapes and eats them and then leaves, to where this guy is triggered to go and eye his way to see who had eaten any of his food. But so we have it to where the fern, even though he had gotten this dagger, we end up having it to where the fern is also a little bit tweaked or a little bit ticked off that she had taken some of the food. He's like, dude, I told you not to eat any of the food. And she's like, well, I'm sorry. It was so tantalizing. So, moving on. So, we end up having it to where the fern comes to see Olivia yet again, and she now has to take care of this bizarrish baby-like creature that looks like a log of wood or whatever, but like it's like some kind of baby-ish looking thing that doesn't quite make sense to me. It also seems that this baby needs like a little dip of blood to be able to work or be able to have food or whatever. And so we end up having it to where Olivia is trying to take care of this baby all while being underneath the bed of her mother, who is also pregnant, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where eventually uh, Olivia and her mother are having an argument, to where eventually Olivia is trying to take care of uh, whatever creature she has, and we have it to where they are talking about fairy tales and how Olivia's mother is basically telling her like fairy tales aren't real, like it's time for you to kind of grow up, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where Olivia is taking this item that Olivia's mother is taking this creature, this whatever, from Olivia and throwing it into the fire and saying that none of this stuff is true, that uh, that Olivia needs to grow up, and so on and so forth. And so when Olivia's creature is being placed within the fire and is burning, we eventually have it to where Olivia's mother is now bleeding from where she is to have a kid. And so we end up having Olivia's mother rush to be taken care of. And we have it to where we find out that Olivia's mother had died giving birth to her brother. Funny enough, we had it to where the captain had predicted that he was to get a son. And we had the doctor who asked him, like, well, hey, like, how is it exactly you knew that you're going to have a son? And he's like, I just know. Because when really looking at it, he's like, well, like, the captain guy is basically like a king. So he wants a son regardless. He doesn't care if he gets a billion children. He just wants a son because his son is going to be the next heir. So we have it to where, of course, this child is a son, luckily for the captain, because what would have happened if she wasn't? Or if the baby wasn't, then maybe would have killed the baby off? I don't know. Who knows? Because he lost the mother anyways. So we end up having it to where now, God, there's probably so much that I probably skipped around about, but it is what it is within this movie. There also is quite a bit of downtime within this film too. There is also a point in time where eventually the captain ends up finding a rebellion member, and he ends up going and just torturing the crap out of this person with these kind of like bizarre-ish looking tools that I guess would be like fairly common, I guess, for the time period. But they're kind of very odd looking tools to torture somebody with. And then eventually we end up having it to where the doctor ends up coming in to check on this rebellion member that they have kind of said, like, okay, go ahead and check on him. We end up having this doctor going and giving this guy a injection, and he ends up leaving. He ends up leaving to where we end up having the captain kind of questioning the doctor, and we end up eventually having also the captain ending up shooting the doctor in the back to where the doctor ends up falling over. And it's like, oh my god, like, this is a doctor. Like, you need this guy to, like, live, basically. But you're gonna go ahead and just kill this guy? Wow. Oakley dokley. So, how very few doctors are there during any time period within any certain era of real time? But anyways, moving on. So, we end up having it to where eventually within this film, we have it to where Olivia is thinking that she's never going to get another fairy tale thing happen to her again. Like, she thinks that it's all quite over, and so on and so forth. And so eventually we have the Fern coming back and saying, like, well, you know what? Like, I'm going to give you one last try. But that happens sometime later. There's a lot of time that happens between that. So, excuse me. So, we have it to where now, like, the captain is basically, like, having his baby, like, wherever he is, and to just kind of, like, keep watch over him because he doesn't want anybody to, like, kill his baby while he's sleeping, basically. So we end up having it to where we have uh, it to where the captain is finding out about some uh, like rebellion members, and he ends up talking to Mercedes about it to kind of see where, like, what she does. Eventually we have it to where the captain is sharing a drink with Mercedes, and we end up having it to where more and more that Mercedes getting very uncomfortable with the captain. So she otherwise decides to run off. She ends up running off, and she ends up going to Mercedes, or Mercedes ends up going to Olivia to say her goodbyes, and we have it to where Olivia is desperately saying, like, take me with you, take me with you. And so we end up having uh Mercedes going, like, no, I can't, like, there's no way. And so, but we end up having Mercedes take Olivia with her anyways, and they end up, like, running off together to where eventually the captain and all of his military men are waiting for her. And so we end up having it to where the captain grabs these letters that Mercedes had hidden away, and he ends up realizing that she is a spy and that she is going to be tortured like the other guy was with all these tools. And we have it to where Mercedes had done this thing where she was, like, cooking, and she had this knife, and she took this knife and she hid it somewhere into her apron, kind of like rolled it up. And so we end up having it to where when Mercedes was getting tortured, we end up having Mercedes have this knife come out yet again to cut herself free. And so while the captain is talking and doing his kind of normal shtick about, like, well, yeah, I'm going to torture you, and so on and so forth, we end up having it to where Mercedes stabs the captain in the back, and when the captain turns around, we end up having Mercedes stabbing the captain in the face to where he, like, she pulls, like, a Joker on him where she, like, cuts a part of his lip because she tells him that she's, like, gonna basically, like, gut him like a pig, and because that's technically what he is, and so on and so forth. I thought that this moment was really awesome, like the whole fact that we end up having it to where Mercedes was mentioning that, like, oh, like, you think that this is going to be really easy because I'm a woman, right? Well, you were wrong. And so we end up having it to where Mercedes, like, just basically just slices the crap out of the captain, and then starts to slowly but surely walk away from this environment with the two army officials saying, like, he let her go? Wait a minute, maybe we should stop her. And so we end up having Mercedes, like, running off as fast as humanly possible to eventually have the military men get on horseback and chase after her, to where eventually the military force meets up with Mercedes, and the resistance ends up killing all of these military men. And we end up having two men on horseback making their way back to the captain to say, like, hey, uh, like, we were outnumbered. Like, there was obviously, like, 50 men out there, and we were just outnumbered. And so we end up having it uh, to where the Fern had come back to tell Olivia that she has one more task to do, and her task is to be able to get her brother and bring her brother to the labyrinth, uh, because before, of course, Moonfall and whatever. And so we end up having it uh, to where Olivia is saying like, well, that's impossible because like I'm not going to be able to like easily make my way through there. And we end up having it to where the Fern ends up giving her a thing of chalk again to basically say, well, like if anything happens, like you can create your own doorway, because she ended up doing that before, where she ended up using a thing of chalk via this wall to make a doorway to make it uh, to be able to make it through one of the obstacles that she had, that she had to do. So we have it to where uh, we have it to where at some point the captain is to be uh, called away to eventually hear what his men have to say about them getting basically shot up, and that they were outnumbered and whatever. And so we have it to where Olivia ends up deciding to go off to get her brother and try to leave. But we end up having the captain ending up coming back into the room and trying to stop Olivia, but he can't. He ends up chasing her all the way out to the labyrinth, but he ends up getting lost, and so we end up having Olivia making her way all the way to the labyrinth to have her talk to the Fern, and the Fern is to say, well, here is your last thing. We we need more blood. And so we want blood so that way you will go and make your way further into this labyrinth. And this will be your final and last task. And we end up having to where Olivia's like, no, like, I will not give any more blood. Like, no, this is not happening. And so we have it to where the Fern is like, are you sure about this? It's like, you have to obey everything that I've said. And so you're going against what I've asked. And we end up having it to where Olivia says, no, like, I will not give up any more blood and whatever. And so it's not happening. And so we have it to where the Fern says, well, okay, but I guess you're not going to get any further than where you are. And so we have it to where the captain chases up after Olivia, and we end up having to where Olivia is talking to nobody. So we are to assess that either the Fern was an imaginable character that only Olivia had seen, or that quite possibly there could be any number of scenarios to go on with this. So we end up having the captain taking his son from Olivia, and then the captain ends up firing upon this child and killing her. And then he ends up walking away with his child to be met by this entire resistance who have now killed everybody on the captain's side. And we end up having it to where the captain is to give the child to Mercedes. And we had this whole thing where we had it to where the captain had wanted his child to know the exact time that his father had died and what day and what whatever, because I guess that's I guess that's like a family thing or whatever. I guess every father needs to know like when exactly was the time of their father's death. And we have it to where Mercedes like tells the captain, it's like, this son of yours will never know you even existed. And the captain's like, what? And immediately right after that, oh, and here was also a thing. We end up having to where there was a slice in this guy's face, like right around the lip, and he ends up re-sewing it back in, like re-sewing this thing. And I'm like, oh my god, this part of this movie is freaking amazing, because when looking at it, I'm like, how could they have done that to where I'm like, dude, I wouldn't be putting like a needle in my mouth and just like, no, like that looked like, I was just like, how did they do that? I'm like, I wouldn't be trusting to put a freaking needle into my face. No. I would have just been like, yeah, I am no. Just no. Just but that's what makes that part like so realistic of just like, was that any like CGI thing where like he was actually not really putting a needle into his face. They like CGI that in afterwards. I don't know, but when looking at it, I was like, man, that scene is crazy, and it looked really real. So moving on. So we end up having right after that, we end up having, and plus he drank like a thing of alcohol right after he sewed himself up, and it was like bleeding off to the side of his face because he put it like a bandage off to the side, and it like bled through. It was really interesting. So anyways, we have it where the captain said like, hey, like tell my son exactly when I'm going to die, exactly at what time and what day and whatever. And so we have Mercedes saying like, dude, your son's gonna never know you even existed. And then they shoot him in the face, and then he ends up just dying and falling over and dying, which was interesting. We have it to where Mercedes makes her way all the way out to the labyrinth to I guess check on Olivia, seeing her dead and seeing her just bleeding out. And so we end up having the blood going and dipping into this labyrinth to where we end up having to where Olivia is now, I guess, what would be the equivalent of her heaven, which is actually just the like her winning, her ticket, her whatever. And so we end up having Olivia uh, talking to the fern, talking to the talking to her mother, talking to her, I guess, biological father, and it's in bizarrely this huge, gigantic, gold like uh, uh, place of sorts. Let's just call it. It's some kind of kingdom of sorts or something along those lines, where we have Fiona just saying like, "Yay, I made it," and I'm like, okay, maybe there's some afterlife of sorts that these characters go into, or maybe this is what Olivia just assumes that the afterlife of this place would be. We end up having to where Olivia's mother didn't say anything about any of these fairy tales prior to this. She even said for her to give up on fairy tales. So I'm not quite exactly understanding like the very tail end of this, where we are just to decide that Olivia had went to her own kind of heaven, or what she imagined that was, and or she had really had succeeded in all she needed was to dip her blood into this thing to eventually be able to succeed. Because we end up having it to where the Fern had mentioned that she had done her final task correctly, and so on and so forth. So, really, that's just how this movie just bizarrely ends, with a death of a child, which I thought was like, good God, really? That's how they end. That's how they do this movie. But I guess there's bits and pieces of here that I thought was like, wow, like this is very vastly different than anything that I have seen. But altogether, it wasn't 100% worth uh, altogether watching, and plus having to watch with subtitles, to be brutally and truly honest. So, anyways, I think with that, I've talked about this movie long enough. Yeah, I will probably forget about this movie right after I've seen it, to be brutally honest. I would probably have to remember, like, oh yeah, I have seen this movie, but there was nothing about it that really stuck out to me, in all brutal honesty. I've seen a lot of odd movies to where, like, those have really stuck out to me compared to this. So that's all that I'm going to say about Pan's Labyrinth. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.